So this is our first sort of episode of these workshops we're planning on doing through Las Cumbres about development and about early childhood development and early intervention. And this workshop is based around gross motor development, which is things like crawling, walking, sitting, rolling over, all those early gross motor, large muscle movements. Um, and which is very exciting. And so today I'm a developmental specialist. My name's Abby Nelson. I work with the 0 to 3 population in early intervention through Las Cumbres Community Services. And I have 4 children. 3 of my children went through early intervention, which is why I'm very passionate about it. And I'd like to introduce Jean Porteous. She is a physical therapist. She works in the early intervention population. She actually worked with my kids and she has an amazing understanding of the human body and an amazing understanding of the developing infant. And so she's amazing at what she does. So right now I'm going to turn the time over to Jean, and she is going to address the birth to 6 months normal gross motor development.
Yeah, let's start with just talking about why gross motor and why is it important in early development. So when we talk about, babies coming into the world, the first thing that they really do is they use their eyes and their head to explore their environment. Then as they begin to develop, they start moving, they start reaching, rolling to their side, rolling to their belly. And this is how babies literally start the cognitive process of exploration. So babies that are active and moving with both sides of their body, both eyes, both ears, all of that stuff is a groundwork foundational skill for learning. Okay. And so it's one of the first things that we notice when our babies come into the world is that they are, turning their head to look at their parent, turning their head to get to the, oral motor source of feeding and survival. So all of this stuff is really critical in the foundation skills of learning cognition, language, social, emotional relationships. Now, there are some things that might, impact gross motor development. Lots of criteria, lots of factors. So I just kind of felt like, since we're talking about typical development, and then we're going to go into some atypical stuff, let's just review a few things that might impact gross motor development right from day one. So we can talk about I think the bottom line is health. How healthy is the pregnancy? How healthy was the birth? Was there any trauma at the birth? All of those kinds of things that we talk about when we, go see our first pediatrician visit, those kinds of things, right? The next thing that involves, so nutrition, health, and birth history is super important. I'd say the next thing is the parent-child relationship, the environmental piece that, creates a strong trust, security, and, that co-regulation piece of, oh, I can now move and my parent's going to be there to keep me safe. Okay. So that we can't ever eliminate how important that relationship piece is. And Las Cumbres has some amazing resources around parent-child relationships. Okay. The next thing that I think is important is what drives movement initially is vision and how important that system is. It's one of the last systems to really come in. So on a lot of our preemie babies or babies that have a history of visual impairment, that's going to impact gross motor development. And so we always do a screening for what the history of vision is and why we need to be looking at that right from day one. Okay. Muscle tone, we have a huge, spectrum of how the brain, how the central nervous system allows the body to move. So we talk about sort of normal limits of muscle tone, the ability to raise up against gravity and lower down with gravity. And then we have high tone and low tone. So at any given point, if you've got a question about tone, I can try to answer it based on whatever, situation you're seeing. Okay. We see a lot of variability in muscle tone. Okay. Temperament. How about, just the basic, my little person is kind of shy. My little baby is really vocal. So temperament can really affect their interest in, oh, I'm really curious, I want to get over to that side of the room to get that toy. So temperament and sort of personality play into gross motor development as well. And we've all seen the kids that are really explorative and kind of fearless. And then we've seen the kids that are a little bit more reserved and a little bit shyer, and how that impacts mobility. Okay. Um, Genetics, I think that's always I mean, that's part of the health issue, but genetics can be, I always say to parents, when they start asking me about feet, let me see your feet, because, how our genetics go into our children is really important. And, on those kids that sometimes we're not sure of their genetic history, there's always a little bit of a question mark there. And that's where we're just really keeping our eyes very objective and very open to, well, maybe there was something that we didn't see early on. Okay. So genetics is a part of gross motor development as well. So atypical motor flag. So as we go through each 6-month session, birth to 3, we're going to talk about some atypical things that we might see in that age group. But it's really important to know that if you see something in your own child, that there's resources. We are a huge resource. We've got Family Strengths Network. There's all sorts of resources. And this whole expansion project into Los Alamos County is part of trying to reach out into this community to expand our services. So, any red flags are always worth the question of a referral to Las Cumbres or a question to one of us at any time. So Abby and I can easily be available for specific questions after the workshop. Okay. Um, Abby, did you want to say something about when to worry? Because I hear you talking about that a lot, and I thought it might be good from you as a parent, to kind of just go over a little bit of that idea.
Honestly, the time when to worry, I mean, there is such a range for development in gross motor. A lot of people sort of have in their heads, child should be sitting at 6 months, should be crawling at 9 months, should be walking at a year. And that's not necessarily true. There is a range of what's considered typical and what's considered normal. I hate that word, but what's considered a typical development. And as long as they're continually making development, that's fine. It's when they sort of stall, when they lag, when there's a point at which, we've been stuck here for a while. Maybe we should look into it. Anywhere between 9 months and 18 months is typical for walking. You have these early walkers who are just those go-getters who want to go, go, go. And then you have those kids who might be more interested in learning to speak, and their speech comes in first. And that's actually something that's really important to recognize, is that speech and gross motor do not develop at the same time. They can't. So usually a lot of kids will go, speech, gross motor, speech, gross motor, speech, gross motor. But then you have these kids who are like, I really want to talk. And that speech comes in and that gross motor might lag behind, or their gross motor might jump ahead and that speech might lag behind. And that's okay, as long as we recognize that that's what it is. And maybe if you're curious and you want to know more and want, then you can make a referral and get an evaluation for that. Or talk to your doctor. They're available, to help through this, because especially when you're a first-time parent and you don't really understand what your child's doing and what is typical and what's normal. And so that's a really great resource.
Okay, great. So we have a screening tool that we did not necessarily do a share screen. I don't think, Abby, did we, on the gross motor thing? So I'm just going to go through birth to 6 months. Okay. And talk about what normal development looks like. It's going to be somewhat of a summary. Okay. So there's a lot that happens those first 12 months of life. In fact, I've got an amazing book called Normal Development of the First 12 Months of Life. There's just so much. It's unbelievable. But so we're going to condense this birth to 6 months. So the first thing that happens for babies is they start turning their head and using their eyes to track and scan their environment and find things like their parent's face and the mobile hanging above their crib. So we get some head rotation. Okay. We're going to keep this, if I use a word that is not, that you're not familiar with, just, flag me a little bit, because PTs tend to use kind of fancy words. So for this video for this workshop, we're going to use words like face up. Okay, so face up, which translates to supine. They can turn their head from midline to the side and then back to midline. And it takes them a couple months to get all the way across from one side to the other. Okay. And sometimes the shape of their head, based on how their head came out of their mama, can affect how they turn their head. So sometimes if a baby was in utero with a side bent neck, their head might be a little flat on that side. So that can affect head turning. So we're always looking at things like symmetrical shape of heads, how babies are turning their head using their eyes based on what's possible. So it takes them a couple months to get 180 degrees of horizontal. Okay. Doesn't happen right away. In fact, the first couple of weeks of baby's vision isn't even kind of like there all the way. So you might see them just gazing, fixing their gaze, not really tracking much. Okay. So that's all normal development. Okay. So then what happens is we start to think about how do babies position themselves on their belly. So here is face down. Okay. So this is a prone position. So the first muscles that come in anti-gravity position are the back of the neck muscles. Okay. So that's why we talk so much about face down positioning, belly time, because those muscles come in first. Okay. We lift up our head before we really do a whole lot of lifting in this position. So those muscles, that's why babies start to pick up their head when they're on their shoulder, mama's shoulder, daddy's shoulder, because those are getting stronger. So head control starts to come in, okay? So it takes a fair amount of strength to move that head against gravity. So once they get that, and once they get this, and now they've got full neck rotation, then we start to get what we call head righting. And that's the ability to hold their head when their body is moved. So here's head righting. If I shift a baby one direction, they're going to correct their head. And that's really coming from the eyes. The system of the vision is driving head righting. Okay. So they want their head to be level. Okay. So if a baby is 3 months old and they're not necessarily righting their head, the first thing I'm going to be really looking into is I want to make sure they're seeing. Okay. So that's some of the head stuff. Remember that development goes head to toe and midline, middle of the body to the distal part of their body. So there's always this, shoulders are going to come in before hands. Hips are going to move before toes, okay? In terms of controlled movements, okay? So that's sort of a basic developmental principle for motor development, okay? We've got the effects of gravity. Sometimes I feel like my babies need to get into a less gravity position. So we talk about side lying and the ability to move with less gravity involved. We talk about rolling skills in this birth to 6 month thing. Typically, babies start to be able to push their themselves onto a prone position on their forearms with their head up. And then it's an accident. They roll off their belly. Okay. Coming from belly to back is often seen first, but not always. There's always this baby that's going to roll from their back to their belly before they figure out how to roll from their belly to their back. So that's the range that Abby's talking about. Not all babies are going to do the same thing at the same time, and that is perfectly fine. I'm looking more at quality of movement and how they're moving against gravity and how they're using both sides of their body. So we're going to call that symmetry. It's going to be a kind of a guiding theme throughout this workshop. Okay. So, all of this, legs coming up, rolling to their side, figuring out how to lift their head over their shoulder. All of that is looking at motor control proximally, head, neck, chest. Okay. All right. So what are some of the things that happen atypically in this age group, birth to 6 months? What do you see, Abby? Sometimes you're calling me and you're saying, Jean, I've got a baby that's
Yeah.
not doing something. What do we see in this age range?
So a lot of times you'll see things like a child won't be lifting their head and tummy. They're not, spending a lot of time on their tummies. And a lot of times you'll see kids who are maybe not reaching out for toys. And again, that's we want to make sure we address vision as well. A lot of times people don't call until it's later that, their child isn't sitting up or their child isn't, but that you can call as soon as you have concerns. And we are always, always happy to evaluate kids, because honestly, the best times, is doing an evaluation where you can tell parents that they're doing just fine. A lot of stuff I also like to talk about during this time is things that you're already doing that are the right things that you're already doing to promote this gross motor development that you don't even know. When your baby is on your tummy and you're on your back and they're lifting their head and smiling at you, you're working on gross motor development. When you are moving to the side and sort of hiding from them and they have to turn their head to look at you, you're working on gross motor development.
Good.
When you're holding their hands and you're clapping their hands together along with a song, you're working on gross motor development. All these things that you already do as a parent, you're supporting this. And it's not necessarily, a child doesn't have a gross motor delay necessarily because a parent is not doing all the right things. That's
Right.
not usually why we see a gross motor issue. It's usually something unrelated to that. Because I always like to say that, just because a child is delayed, it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong as a parent. You're doing all the right things. So we're just going to give you some ideas. And that's what I love about early intervention is that we're doing a lot of parent coaching and how to tweak things just a little bit to increase, to promote that gross motor development, to promote any development actually. So all these little tweaks we can give you. So all these things you're doing is already right, but things that you want to watch for is, oh, my kid can't roll over yet and they've reached this point where they should be rolling over. Give us a call. But also it's, or talk to your doctor about it. Also, there's always, and I know our first instincts as parents is to call our friends or call our siblings who have kids and ask them questions. That's always tends to be who, I don't know about you, that's who I always turn to was,
Sure.
people, my support system.
Yep.
And so,
I think one of the biggest ones is that babies are now in these fancy positioners a lot, right? We've got our bucket seat, we've got our bouncer, and when a baby isn't necessarily having really good head control, what happens when we put our baby in these positioners and leave them there is they drop their head, they're kind of stuck there, right? Because they don't have the ability to bring it up. And then we start seeing some things that happen because of how they've been positioned. So I always talk about the importance of movement and not having babies in things too long. And no one position is good for very long, okay? So, talking about some of the poor tolerance on belly as well, they don't come into the world really feeling like they can breathe when they're on their belly. So we can come up with things like putting them on your chest or putting them on something a little softer, being down there on the floor with them, looking at them, giving them a mirror to look at, that kind of stuff. So there's, and then the other thing that we're seeing a lot of right now is asymmetrical head and head shape and neck stuff. So I think I'm kind of going to that place of we got to get our babies out of these fancy bucket seats and out of the bouncers so that we can let their heads move sort of in a less gravity assisted way. Okay. So I kind of go back to that. And then, sometimes they come into the world with a head shape issue. And so just know that there's things that we can do in terms of positioning for that as well. Okay. So now,
or if they come in with a breathing issue, if they, were on
respiratory.
oxygen as a baby,
Yep.
they might not like being on their tummy. And it's hard, very hard. If you have a baby that does not want to be on their tummy, it's hard for moms to put them on their tummy because it makes them sad and nobody wants to make their baby sad.
Good.
So it's I have a lot of compassion for that because I had a child who was like that.
Yeah.
And so it's hard. And to push your child where they don't want to go, it's hard. And a lot of this stuff comes naturally and for parents. And so we want to, sometimes you have to nudge kids in the right direction. For the most part, the things that parents do, but some kids need a little nudge in the right direction.
Yep. Okay, so then we're going to move on to 6 to 12 months. Okay, so this is my favorite age range. I love 6 to 12 months because they really start being able to sit. They start being able to get in and out of positions. So now they're kind of mobile. right? So the first really big thing that happens at 6 to 8 months is the rolling. And some babies use that consecutively. They roll across the floor. They roll in a sort of typical way with using flexors as opposed to extensors. So, when you see a baby rolling with a lot of extension, that might be a bit of a red flag. We want those flexors to come in, and shoulders are under the, hands are under the shoulders, that kind of thing for, raising the chest off the floor. Then they get into this idea that they can start to sit, okay? And they always are placed in sitting by the parent, right? And we've got all these fancy positioners, bumbo chairs and floor sitters and things, but nothing replaces the idea of sitting between your parent's leg on the floor and doing some weight shifting. So the idea of now starting to be able to weight shift, now we're down in the thorax. As the baby reaches for the toy, they have to do something in their middle part of their trunk to come back to midline. So these are called weight shifting in and out of sitting, coming all the way into sitting from side lying, all the way out of sitting to reach for the toys. That's the beginning of weight shifting and postural reactions, okay? The ability to move my body in and out of gravity assisted positions,
And
okay?
did you want to do the video on the rolling
Let's
video
let's
that we
do
have?
rolling. Let's do
Okay.
rolling. And then there's also one on crawling. So Abby, I'm just going to get through this section and then we'll do both of those videos, okay?
Yeah.
So belly crawling comes in often because now they're on their belly and they're weight shifting. So instead of weight shifting and rolling, now they're weight shifting to get the toy. So they're bringing one leg up and they're reaching for the toy and they're doing some combat crawling. And then they figure out how to raise their bottom against gravity off the floor, be on hands and knees. It's the most exciting thing ever for parents. My baby's rocking, and then they start figuring out how to move on hands and knees. Okay. It takes a lot of strength to do that. And that's why it takes 9 months sometimes for babies to get into that 4-point crawling reciprocal movements, because it's a lot of shoulder girdle strength. Okay. You also have to have a lot of reflexes integrated. And I hope that we can get to this at another workshop. We can do a whole thing on reflexes and how important they are and how important they are to integrate. But one of the big ones is what the head does when you're on hands and knees. So if you can't hold your head up on hands and knees, you're not going to be able to crawl. So that's one of the reflexes that we can talk about in a future workshop. So then they start getting into some upright stuff. So skills like kneeling, standing, and cruising. But we've got a kind of a cool little 2-second video on rolling. And then we've got a really great video on some asymmetrical crawling, okay? Which is something that we're seeing a lot more of. Okay, Abs, go ahead.
So this first video I'm going to share is a video about crawling or about rolling and teaching your baby to roll over. I'm going to share my screen real quick.
Okay, thank you.
Body weight just enough to give her the opportunity to roll over. Another way that you can try to get your baby to roll from her tummy is to hold a toy that she likes in her line of vision, but just out of reach. Allow her to try to go for it while you raise it up to encourage her to roll over while she is trying to reach for it.
So that's the video about rolling and getting a child to go from their tummy to their back. And then we also have, this is an asymmetrical crawl. It's muted. You won't hear the mother making crazy, crazy things, saying crazy things to their child to get them to crawl towards you, because that mother is me. And this was my child in his asymmetrical crawl. You see him crawling toward the football, and then it rolls away, and then you're going to see him from behind, how he's going to put that one leg up and pull that other leg behind him. That's an asymmetrical, sometimes they call it a 3-point crawl. It's an asymmetrical crawl.
Yep. So what
Such
this little guy is not doing is he's not weight shifting, right? He's staying on that right side the whole time in terms of pelvic weight shifting. Okay. So he is using really one side only and not crossing over neural pathways to the other side. Okay. Now there's lots of ways to do that. There's other asymmetrical crawls. One of them that I've seen is called bunny hopping, where they bring both legs forward. They're on their knees, but now both knees come forward at the same time. So that's kind of can be something that we see in our CP population, where they really can't dissociate one leg from the other. So they bring both legs forward, both arms forward. There's no kind of weight shifting from side to side. Okay. The other crawl that I've sort of seen is that they really have their hips way flexed. In other words, they don't have, so they can't extend their hip like, so they really don't have the ability to bring that hip back. So that can be a little bit of an asymmetrical crawl too, that they stay in way too much flexion. And that usually is because they don't have the shoulder girdle strength. So there's lots of reasons why babies learn to do things. And my job as a PT is to sort of piece it apart and see what we can do to help them gain some stability in the other side of the body, right?
And that
So
back and forth, the symmetry between the sides and working on, teaching a child to do that both sides, that 4-point crawl is so important, because what it does is it creates pathways between the two sides of the brain, which is important for development. So even children like my little guy here, he did that 3-point crawl, but even though he was walking later on, they still had him go back and do a 4-point crawl in play, just as part of play, to encourage those pathways to develop, because he didn't do a natural 4-point crawl when he was little. And so they did it during PT. And he was in PT when he was little with Miss Jean over here. And to teach him how to do that 4-point crawl, because it is important for those pathways to develop. So that's why we want that 4-point crawl to come in. So even if they progress to walking, we still want, like, a long time crawling is not a bad thing, especially if they're doing a 4-point crawl. It actually encourages a lot of brain development. So we like that. So
yeah.
it's okay if your child.
Sometimes, yeah, and sometimes you hear the word patterning, that people talk about the crawling as a kind of a patterning neurological development thing. But so there's that. Now, there's also a bunch of sitting postures that we talk about in this age range, right? So, babies don't automatically come into the world sitting very erect, right? So the first thing is, they prop with their hands, they're pretty much hinged forward, their back might be rounded. Those spinal curves don't really start developing. So usually you see a fairly straight spine. Okay. But the main thing that I like to talk about in sitting is that they are able to move in sitting. That's the important piece of sitting, that they're not just sitting and stuck, but that they can move. Now, one of the things that babies learn um, is how to sort of prevent weight shifting. So we've got a little video on Wsitting, and we can show it now if we want to, but babies go through a typical Wsitting pattern between 10 and 12 months, okay? Where they might be crawling all over the place and they really aren't sitting much. So they drop down into a Wsitting with their feet beside their hips. It's when the baby gets stuck there that I get worried. Okay. So when you walk into the kindergarten classroom and you see everybody on the floor in circle time, 50% of those kids are sitting in a W pattern instead of in a Taylor cross leg pattern. It started early on, and it is a super big pattern of like a habitual pattern that is hard to break. So we like to talk about that as a kind of an atypical sitting pattern. But I want people to remember that it's not atypical at some point in development. It's just that if they get stuck there, okay? The other way that kids sit is sometimes they really can fix their legs. So it's okay for babies to sit with their legs open and long, but I often like to get those legs relaxed and not stiff here and not too wide. So I start narrowing base of support kind of stuff. I get one leg in. I talk through parents through some of that stuff so that they can easily weight shift in and out of that without overusing their leg muscles to hold them up. Okay. So what else happens in this position is kids start to pull up to standing, and it's a really exciting thing, right? They start to get to the furniture, they pull themselves up. So once again, we're working on weight shifting, right? So there's lots of ways to do that, pulling to stand. Usually I like my kids to go through kneeling, half kneeling to stand. The other way that they do it is they extend both knees at the same time, and there's no weight shifting. So it's sort of like that concept of weight shifting being eliminated. So they come on their knees and then they just sort of pop up instead of doing it like this. Okay. So just if there's one thing that you take away from the workshop today, how important it is on the developmental muscles to weight shift and how that is a neuromotor kind of sign. Okay. So Ed, let's show that Wsitting one, because I bet we're going to have some questions about that in the chat box.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
All right.
All right, so I'll start this video. It's a 2-minute video about Wsitting, and as Jean said, you know, Wsitting is common when they're shifting between positions at a certain age. It's when they start using that as a base of support instead of you know, transitioning from one position to another. When it becomes how they sit, that's when it becomes a concern. And let me share this with you.
Does your child W-sit? It's exciting to watch your baby learn to roll over, crawl, and sit up on her own. He's getting stronger every day, using different muscles to accomplish new milestones. But a seemingly innocent way of sitting may actually be preventing your child from developing certain muscles and skills. It's called W-sitting. W-sitting is a position where a child's bottom is on the floor while her legs are bent at the knees and fan out and back, forming the shape of a W. Many children sit this way because they can balance better. A child just learning to sit up by herself will naturally choose the easiest way to sit in balance so they feel secure and have more freedom to use their hands for play. However, W-sitting increases muscle tightness and prevents children from rotating and turning side to side. Children need practice reaching across their body in order to strengthen core muscles and develop correctly. W-sitting puts strain on the hips and knees and does not encourage a child to distribute weight evenly from one side of the body to the other, a skill that is necessary for walking and other fine motor activities, like writing. Once a habit is learned, it can be very hard to break, so before your child even starts W-sitting, teach her other ways to sit, like sitting with her legs crossed or straight out in front of her. You can also have your child side sit, with knees bent to one side, or simply have her sit on a beanbag or chair. If your child moves in and out of W-sitting, don't worry. As long as he uses a variety of sitting positions, it's not a cause for alarm. But have your child avoid long periods of W-sitting to further develop skills and strengthen muscles.
That was great.
I really like that video.
Yeah,
I think
that was
it is
great.
a great description of W-sitting, how, you know, don't worry if they're using W-sitting occasionally, as long as they're not using it as their only way of sitting.
Right. And one of the things that they didn't talk about in that video, as much as I do, is that when you're W-sitting, it can affect your standing posture. So we see a lot of kids coming in with alignment issues. Some parents are kind of calling it pigeon-toed. It's a kind of a colloquial word, in towing. But what happens in W-sitting is the whole femur bone rolls in and gets kind of stuck there, and then it changes, it gets modeled in a certain way that affects alignment. So that takes us into 12 to 18 months. Kids start to stand and have dynamic standing balance coming in. You know, they get up on tall kneeling, they start using weight shifting and kneeling, coming to stand, cruising, and letting go and standing without any support, and then doing some independent ambulation. Okay, so some of the things that that we see in this really important age, is their ability to stand on one leg, to let go, to walk forward. So you have to have the pelvic strength. They start to be able to bend their knees. So you start to get a lot of knee strengthening coming in. They start learning directionality. Oh, I have to turn and rotate. I have to use my eyes to turn, and then my trunk follows, and then I can start. So when you're really looking at new walkers, they're not really rotating too much. They're certainly not swinging their arms. And so a lot of the atypical stuff that comes in at this point is if a child has a little bit of too much tone in their lower extremities, they may go up on their toes. Or if they've got some sensory differences, they were, in the NICU for a long time and had a lot of sensory trauma to their feet, they might not like the way standing feels. So some kids go up on their toes, sort of perseverance, to preserve that intact feeling of their feet. So we see toe standing, we get referrals for that kind of stuff. So alignment, um, being on their toes, which is a really difficult thing for kids. Their whole weight line is going to be now pushed forward when they're walking, and they're not going to have a heel toe gait pattern. So I get a lot of referrals around that. That can set up things like balance issues. So one of the classic things that happens at this 12 to 18 month is motor control, right? And when children are on their toes or on one side more than the other, they may not look so coordinated. So we get referrals based on my child falls a lot, or my child moves in sort of clumsy ways. And so this is all happening right around 12 to 18 months. We're really laying down those motor control and motor planning pathways that teach children how to do things at a higher motor level. Okay. But it all starts right around now. Okay. They also learn to be fairly secure against gravity. Things like climbing up, the classic thing, my kid's now standing on top of the table, right? Or standing on top of the slide and the parents right there scared. Yeah. They're starting to get really secure in how their body and their posture reacts when they're off the ground. So that starts at 12 to 18 months as well. Okay. So we see a lot of, terrain challenges. They want to walk over obstacles. They start, sort of figuring out how to walk over things, and then come stairs. So in 12 to 18 months, stairs are just coming in. Okay. So what are some of the atypical things that we might see that we talked about? We might see some gait asymmetries, meaning that they're walking a little differently. They either stay in that wide base, or they're on their toes, or their stride lengths aren't even. They may not be able to stand on one foot to walk over something, or if they do try to walk over something, they need a lot of support. So those are some red flags. My child really has a hard time standing on one leg to get over an obstacle. We've got a walking video, Gab, I think. Should we do that one? All right, let's do that one, Abby.
We do. All right. And this one it's a really short video about, and it has a little new walker in there, and it's really fun to watch.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Sawyer and I'm 12 months old. Most babies take their first steps around their first birthday, but the age range varies from 9 to 18 months. Some of my friends are still crawling, and others have been walking for some time now. I just started walking, so now I can really get around and explore. I haven't completely mastered this walking thing yet, so sometimes I like to hold on to different objects to help me balance.
Nice. So we saw a wide base of support on that little guy. His arms were up around his shoulders, which we call mid to high guard. It's just all this postural strengthening coming in. And as they gain that strength and that dynamic balance stuff, their arms come down, and then they start swinging them once they get really organized with their spine. Okay.
And it's also, if you do have a child who is not walking and you do have concerns, a lot of times it's a good thing to just check it out, because you never know if it could be something regarding feet, like that brings a lot into it. Like if you have a child who has pronation where their feet are rolling in, it's going to be harder for them to, maintain stability. And a lot of times, like Jean said, that's genetic. You have like, oh, my dad had flat feet, or my mom had feet that rolled in. And, and so you might know from your family history or from your, something that runs in your family, like it's always good to just check it out and just
Yep.
talk to your doctor about it.
Yep. And it takes a while to develop foot reactions and arches. Okay. So they all come in fairly flat footed. And they're all hip and knee is what happens with our early walker. Okay. So now, Abby, we're at 1040 something. We want to make sure, do you guys see any questions in the chat box?
I
Really
don't see any questions right now. I did want to share this last video though that Jane shared, because I thought it was such a great one about how gross motor development is play, and that most of development is play. And this is just a fun video of kids jumping in puddles, because that is just such a great it's such a great activity for kids.
Do it again.
Oh my goodness.
The siblings getting each other jumping in the puddles.
Now Sophie's turn.
He didn't have the right button on.
Nice. So yeah, jumping is a blast once kids start really moving off the ground against gravity. So 18 to 24 months is when that starts. They start doing some things like running, fast walking, stairs, lots of climbing, and jumping is starting in. And some of the atypical stuff that we see is that it's really hard for some kids to get themselves off the ground. They just really don't have the strength. They've got low muscle tone, or they just are fearful. Okay. So there's a lot of things that come into play with being able to jump. And then 24 to 36 months is just higher motor skills. So we talk about the ability to get on and off things like the tricycle and the ride-on toy. We talk about motor planning skills, learning new things, things like climbing the rung ladder at the park, being able to go down the slide without falling backwards.
It looks like we have a question real quick in the chat box.
Great.
It says, sorry, let me just give me a second. I have to scroll up a little bit. Is it a pink flag when a baby is not independently walking at 15 months, very few steps between furniture, but there are plenty of opportunities in the environment to promote exploration?
I think it's fine. I'd like that baby to start letting go a little bit more. So in standing, if you can kind of give them some ideas on how to stand without as much support. So standing balance comes in, and that, once they get that standing balance, then they're going to take a step or two to get to the solid place of either a parent or a piece of furniture. So I think 15 months is still okay, as long as they've kind of gone through some of the sequence stuff before that.
When should we make a referral for a child if they're a late walker?
Oh, that's a great question, right? So, can we talk about what late is? I always feel like if a child's not walking by 18 months, I want to know why. And I'm not going to necessarily say that it's, that it's not going to happen around that time, but I'd like to know why they're not doing it. So I think a referral, if there's a question around their upright mobility skills, it's always worth knowing why they're not getting it and what we can do to help. Okay. So,
And
yeah.
here's another question. At what point should your child not be sitting in the W position? And
Yeah.
so my answer for that one is as long as they're not doing it most of the time. If they're still transitioning into different sitting positions, that's good. But if they're staying in the W sit most of the time, I would correct it. And the way you can correct it with a vocal prompt, I did that with my child. I'd say crisscross applesauce, and then I'd switch their feet to forward. And that's what how I would do that. And I'd just correct it and make it, I wouldn't make it a huge deal, but just to train those feet to go forward. And it got to the point where I could just say crisscross applesauce and they would move their feet forward. So it's just something you want to correct if they're doing it all the time. If it's something they're using as a transitional position or they're sitting in it sometimes when they're doing something, it's not as big of a concern.
Totally agree. Good explanation there.
Thank you so much for coming today and joining in our discussion.